In this lecture, I want to cover some political advice that was given, formulated by different scholars, very inspiring scholars, in my opinion. 5 scholars that I greatly admire. And these scholars are King Solomon, Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician, Guillaume Groen van Britscher, the Dutch statesman, Abraham Kuyper, also Dutch statesman, and then the novelist C.S. Lewis. Now, all these scholars are very different, have very different backgrounds, and lived and worked and taught in very different historical periods. But what's interesting is that they all pronounced lectures, they gave conferences, they gave speeches, and those speeches have been passed on to us. So it is very interesting to listen to those, to read those speeches, because it gives you the impression, or you can imagine how it must have felt when these speeches were delivered at the time. And so we're going to look at them one by one, and especially look at the political advice that they give us. And how we can use this advice in our work as advisors of politicians, essentially. So the first scholar I would like to look at is King Solomon. The tradition has it that he reigned between 970 and 931 before Christ era. And he wrote a number of books, at least that's what the tradition teaches us. The Book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and also Song of Songs, with some very interesting advice. Especially Song of Songs gives some advice that could even be described as sexual advice, or love advice, I should probably say. But the other books really provide some wisdom. Now, King Solomon is a very interesting character, of course. He was the third king of the kingdom of Israel, the ancient kingdom of Israel. And of course, he is known for his very advanced wisdom. Now, of course, something that has always puzzled me is that towards the end of his life, he started making some terrible mistakes. He got involved with thousands of concubines, and his wealth, his personal wealth, became more important than anything else, etc., in spite of his great wisdom, and which is something that's always puzzled me. But we're not going to discuss this in this lecture. I would just like to discuss some advice which he may not have completely applied in his own life, but some advice about how to be a good ruler, a good governor, a good politician, a good political leader that we can see in his work. And of course, Solomon's wisdom is famous. When you look at the story of the Solomonic judgment, for example, but there's many more elements that we can highlight, and so I'll just highlight them one by one, in trying to go over some excerpts, some quotes from these 2 books, the Book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, which are also very interesting because they always start, every paragraph almost is started with "my son," so it's like he's speaking to someone, he's lecturing, he's giving advice, and so that's advice we can heed as well in our context. Before I go into looking at different verses, one very important point that is made in Solomon's work are the 2 meanings of the concept of wisdom. And there's this distinction that can be made between ethical or religious wisdom and wisdom in administration. And of course, ethical wisdom is related to the fear of God and also discernment. And administrative wisdom is, related to how to manage complex political projects. So like in the case of King Solomon, of course, the whole project, the building of the temple, was a huge logistical operation, and that required a lot of administrative wisdom. So these two types of wisdom are important, and King Solomon had both types of wisdom. And I think we can take this as an encouragement that we need to strive to obtain both types of wisdom as well. And in the secular world, this is particularly important because very often, from a managerial perspective, a secular humanist managerial perspective, administrative wisdom is the only thing that's being looked at. But there's also this other ethical wisdom that is also key for being a good leader. So in Proverbs 21 verse 1, it says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will." And well, what this really refers to is that even though a king may be an absolute ruler over his subjects with absolute authority, he is still subject to a king, the King of Kings, right? If God describes himself or is described as the King of Kings, that means that he is the absolute ruler over all the other smaller rulers. And actually, we can consider that this is really a source of great political comfort, knowing that there is one above who rules all rulers. Then in Ecclesiastes, it says, "Better is a poor and a wise child than an old and foolish king, and who will no more be admonished." And here we see something where essentially King Solomon describes how lonely it can be at the top, how lonely it can be in power. And so this story really here speaks of a king who's rising to power, who becomes complacent and foolish because he's alone, or does not act or act on his own and does not listen to his friends. And so really the importance of companionship, of having advisors. You can climb up the ladders of success and become important, but you cannot do it alone. You always need advisors, which is, by the way, a very big problem that I've observed with Christian politics throughout the world. Because a Christian politician can become elected, but then he's on his own and he needs the advice from his constituency, from experts. Otherwise, it will just be a failure, right? So this is also a very important point to take into consideration. "Take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne shall be established in righteousness." Proverbs 25 verse 5. Okay, and this actually discusses a similar point about the importance of advisors. Advisors are necessary in every government. But of course this warning, only honest and wise advisors should be accepted. And so government needs to have a staff that has integrity. And so this whole idea of the two types of wisdom, and especially the ethical wisdom, should also be part of not only the leader but also his staff, his advisors. So not only should the leader have advisors, but these advisors need to be virtuous. "The king by judgment established the land, but he that received gifts overthrow it." Now, this is a very clear warning against corruption, against bribes. And so obviously bribery is wrong, but it will corrupt and destroy a nation. So all kinds of favors, kickbacks, privileges that are given by lobbyists, to influence the law and influence decision making, are of course wrong and will destroy the nation. Right? And this is a very clear and obvious statement that really must be taken into consideration. "A wise king scattered the wicked and bridged the wheel over them." Well, Proverbs 20:26. Now, this is a verse that really emphasizes that a wise king, so a ruler, needs to be just and fair, and therefore criminals, rebels, disloyal people, well, need to be punished strictly and severely. And that will help a nation to greatness. So a just king is also a fair king, and sometimes this may be hard it's difficult decisions that need to be made, and crime should never be accepted. Many seek the ruler's favor, but every man's judgment comes from the Lord. Proverbs 29, verse 26. This is also a phrase that really highlights the importance of limited government. Government can help. Government has a role, and needs to protect and provide for the vulnerable. That's a biblical mandate. But people should not place their hope on the government. They should place their hope in God, naturally, put their trust in Him, but do not expect everything from the government. And of course, we live in a time where more and more is expected from the government, and this is not necessarily a good thing. So this is another ideological warning that we can infer from King Solomon. There's much more in the wisdom, the books of wisdom by King Solomon, but these are a few points that I think we can I can leave you with for now. Okay. The second scholar I would like you to consider is Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician and philosopher, and the advice he gives in a series of lectures called 3 lectures about the conditions of great. So that's important people.
So the first scholar I want to talk about is Blaise Pascal, so the 17th century French mathematician, philosopher, and then I'll talk about 2 other inspirational leaders. But so Pascal, he pronounced actually 3 speeches to a duke in 1670, and in those lectures to this duke, he gives him advice on how to be a good ruler, how to be a good duke, basically. And the first advice he shares with this duke is he actually uses a very biblical method of teaching, because he uses allegory. So he tells him a story, and so I'll tell you this story, and this is how it goes. So once upon a time, it's how most stories start, right? So once upon a time, there was a man who went to sleep at night. And he was a very simple person. He went to sleep at night, and then he woke up the next morning, but he was very surprised to find out that he did not wake up in his own bed, but he was actually on the shore of an island, miraculously transported to that island, and he did not know that island. He had never been there before. He also did not know how to leave that island. So that was, a big surprise to him, and he did feel, very disturbed and actually also, lost. Now, what happened is that on that island there was a king, and the people of that island loved that king very much. And what happened was that king had disappeared mysteriously. But this man who suddenly woke up on that island looked very much physically, he looked very much like this king that was so loved by the people of that island. And so basically the people of the island were just so happy that the king they loved so much had returned, because that's what they thought. They thought that man was actually their king. And so this man, he said, well, okay, I'm a simple man where I came from. This is actually a very good dream, right? And okay, I'll accept. And I'll make them believe that I'm their king, because that's what they want to believe in any case. So I'll be their king. But then he was always aware of this, this difference because to himself he had to admit that really he was not a king, he was just an ordinary person. But to the people of that island, he was the king, and he was treated with all the privileges and honors and everything that a king received. And so, what does Pascal tell this duke? He said, well, you're that king, you're in this situation, okay? So you are a duke, and you have authority, you have properties, you have all the privileges of ruling, over your subjects. But really, you're just an ordinary man, just like all your subjects. You're not very different from your subjects. And what Pascal tells him is, well, let's not change this. Remember, this is the 17th century, and so Pascal is not, revolutionary at all. And he says it's fine. Nobility, it's all fine. Aristocracy, it's all fine. It's not a problem. You can be a duke and you can enjoy, the privileges of being a duke. But what's important is that you don't forget, that you always remember that you're just a man like all your subjects. So don't become too proud. And that's the first advice Pascal gives to this duke. And this applies to all of us. And this applies to our leaders in business and in politics, but it also applies to us, right? All the talents that we have, all the properties that we enjoy, anything, it's not that we deserve that, right? And again, Pascal is very conservative, so it's not like, he says property is theft, like Marx and Engels said, right? No, that's fine, just leave it that way. But remember, to be honest and a fair ruler over your subjects. So that's the first advice that Pascal shares with his duke in his lecture. The second advice is actually related to a differentiation that Pascal makes, a difference between what he calls greatness of establishment and greatness of nature. And it's a little bit the same thing. He says, well, what's establishment? What's greatness of establishment? The establishment is everything that's related to, in the case of the duke, his title, his property, the institution that gives him his position. That's establishment. And so Pascal says, duke, when I speak to you, I kneel down, because that's, the result of your establishment, the greatness of your establishment. That's what you deserve, because you're a duke. Okay, but it's very different when you're talking about greatness of nature. And so Pascal speaks about a mathematician like him, who Pascal says was a better mathematician than he was. He says he has greatness of nature, greatness because of his merits, because he's a greater mathematician. So that's another difference Pascal makes, just to get the point across that as a ruler you should try to. It's fine to enjoy the privileges that you have, but it's much better, much more important to try to really receive the honor based on your accomplishment, based on your merits. So that's the second advice. This all might seem very obvious, but try to apply it, right? This is I think just very key. And then the third lecture that Pascal gives to this duke. In this third lecture, he gives some advice on how to be a good ruler. And this actually is very interesting because it reminds us of Niccolo Machiavelli, who also gave advice to a prince, and that was 1 century before. But he gave very perverse advice. It was about how can you conquer power and how can you stay in power. And how can you use manipulation and deceit and all kinds of dirty tricks to stay in power? Pascal, he does not mention that, but he gives a different approach, a moral approach, based on values, based on solid principles. And so what he tells the ruler is, well, listen, what you need to be a good ruler is to satisfy the needs and the desires of your subjects. And this connects very much to what Justin was sharing about rich and poor, how to organize a society, and how to satisfy those needs. You need to think about it, right? But Pascal says, if at least you try to satisfy the needs and the desires of your subjects, you'll be a good ruler. Now, and why does he say this? You'll be a good ruler because if you do this, you won't be, despotic ruler, an autocrat. You're not abusing of your power. You're not trying to take advantage of your position. You're really honestly trying to meet the needs of your subjects. So that if you do that, as a very minimum, you will be a good ruler. But if you want to be an excellent ruler, then you need to do something more. You need to lead your subjects towards charity. Charity is this old theological term, which is also translated as love. Love wins, right? Justin. But so you need to lead your subjects to charity. Yeah, if you want to be an excellent ruler, you need to go beyond just satisfying the needs and the desires of your subjects, but really lead them to understand, and to overcome, their primitive desires, and make them, a little less selfish, a little less worried about their own needs, and lead them to charity. That means to serve others, to be a little more altruistic. And I think everything that was shared, especially by Justin, but also by June, I think speaks to this.
And the third scholar I would like to present is Guillaume Groen van Prinsterer, who presented this famous series of lectures called Unbelief and Revolution in 1847. And the wisdom contained in it is far-reaching.
This author. Let's now jump to another author, name of Guillaume Groen van Prinsterer. And the name is difficult to pronounce, as I mentioned earlier, because he's Dutch. But he was a Dutch Reformed statesman of the 19th century. And in a series of lectures that are actually quite famous, called Unbelief and Revolution, that won't be translated to Spanish in 2010, by the way, he gives also a series of principles and advices to rulers. And this can apply to politics, but also to business, also to economics, and also to your personal lives. And the first thing, and it's very dense, so I'll just summarize a few of his teachings. But the first thing, or the most important thing to me, that Groen van Prinsterer in his work underlines is he makes a call to social transformation. He invites everyone to work towards social transformation. And so this is the interesting, the background of this is by just analyzing the narrative of creation, the sequence that exists in both the Old Testament, the New Testament, but also in literature. The sequence is that from something ugly, God goes and transforms it into something beautiful. Right? That's what happens with creation. I think the concept of creation is not correct. I don't know, what the proper translation should be, but it's, when you read at that, you look at that narrative, it's actually a recreation. Because before creation there was already something was already there, and it was dirty, and it was dark, and it was, difficult and ugly. Now, and that, God took that and transformed it into something beautiful, right? Well, and that's the same, the same sequence you see even also in the New Testament, right? Jesus dies, okay? But that's actually something good, because from something negative, something positive starts, right? Salvation of the world, etc. So you got that narrative that's very powerful. Now, these are all myths, unless you believe in them, right? But just treat them as myths, as foundational myths of Judeo-Christian Western culture. And you see how important it is, even people who don't believe in it, that this literally happened, etc. They do subscribe to this narrative of social transformation, of improving, something from something bad. So you can transform something bad into something good, and that's really the task of politics. But it's also the task of business. Taking the resources, what you have, fallen creation, and transforming it and making it into something better. And so, this sequence, this creational sequence is I think very unique, and actually it's also probably, I'm actually convinced of this, it's the philosophical basis for the progress and the development that has happened in the Western, Judeo-Christian world. It's these values that have shaped, Western culture. And so I believe, this call to transformation is just something very, very powerful. And whether you do it within your company or within your personal life or in politics, doesn't matter. But the call is not only to be transformed, but also to transform culture, right? Culture, interpreted broadly, right? So that's I think the first main point from Prinzer's lectures. The second important teaching I want to share with you tonight is the call to witness that Prinzer makes. And what does he mean by that? Not, he's not saying you should say hallelujah everywhere you go, right? No, what's important is that in every sphere of life you glorify the Creator, right? And that's where we get a definition of politics that it's not the politics that you usually look at or you usually think of. But politics is about promoting a development vision of society based on values. And that's what's important. But promoting values, which is basically glorifying the Creator in every sphere of life, which is promoting social transformation, you have to be consistent. That's where, and June really told me that last year, the concept of integrity comes from, to be whole, right? You need to be consistent. So you cannot, that's what Koen says, you cannot promote values if you don't live by those values, right? So there are many examples where earlier today I mentioned this example of a president from Paraguay, Bishop Lugo, who actually, had a very complicated life, with being a bishop, a Catholic bishop. He had children. He was involved in corruption. Many strange things he did in his personal life. But everyone was saying, well, we don't care what he did in his personal life. He's promoting good values. He's promoting good policies, right? Well, what Koen is saying, no, that's not possible. You cannot promote good values if you don't live by those values, right? And so this is just this call to witness is actually much more than just saying hallelujah everywhere you go, right? It's about this walk of integrity and promoting values, but also living by those values, and therefore also.
Now let's go to Abraham Kuyper, former Dutch Prime Minister and visionary founder of the anti-revolutionary political party. And when he founded the Free University of Amsterdam, he pronounced a lecture called Sovereignty in its Own Circle. And that's where he really presented this concept of sphere sovereignty, which is actually at the core of Reformed political philosophy. And well, as you can see, the original concept is probably already known by most of you, but it's really an idea, an extension of the ordering, the creational ordering of society. So what Abraham Kuyper says is, well, what we can infer from the creational order as described in Genesis is that society is composed of a number of different spheres, and these spheres are independent from each other. They have a separate sovereignty, separate authority structure, but nevertheless they are interrelated. And this is a graphical representation of this concept of sphere sovereignty, and this represents really the ideal society, the way society should be ordered in Abraham Kuyper's view, and essentially it is a perspective that emphasizes the autonomy, not the autonomy from the creator, but the autonomy from other spheres of each individual sphere, and also underlines the reduced, limited scope of government. Government is not entitled to interfere in other spheres that have their own authority structure and their own rationale and their own way of functioning. Government's function is only to create the conditions so other spheres can flourish, but they should not intervene unnecessarily in other spheres, especially in the church sphere, but also in the school sphere, the family sphere, etc. And of course, this goes against the classic view of the state, where the state is represented as a power pyramid, a pyramid where the government is on top, and the government is ruling over all aspects of society. And Abraham Kuyper says, no, this is not the right way society should be organized. Now, that's the original concept by Abraham Kuyper. I have, in my research on religious freedom, developed a reflection on what sphere sovereignty means for religious freedom. So let's take a look at this. First, well, of course, there's a clear separation of the church and government sphere. And of course, this notion of separation of church and state is also contained in this view of sphere sovereignty. That means that the government should not be allowed to meddle in the internal affairs of churches, and vice versa. Churches, of course, do not have any political authority as such. But of course, the existence of this boundary between the church and the government sphere does not mean that religion can play no role in politics. In fact, if people are inspired by their religious convictions and use that to intervene in politics, they're just making use of the right of freedom of expression. There's no subordination of the government sphere to the church sphere. This is, of course, very often misunderstood. And the separation between church and state is not the same thing as separation between faith and politics. Okay, and of course, religious freedom encompasses the autonomy to live according to one's religious perspective in each sphere of society, which is also something that's very important, because when one looks at religious freedom, one thinks very often only of the church sphere and of freedom of worship, but really religious freedom is much more, and actually there is religious expression in every sphere of society, and all these spheres, the right to religious expression in all these spheres should be respected and should be protected. That's I think a very interesting extension or application of sphere sovereignty. So I have tried to revisit sphere sovereignty, trying to make it even more applicable to the analysis of religious freedom, because sphere sovereignty represents an ideal ordering principle of society, right? It's prescriptive, it's normative, but I suggest it can also be used as an analytical category, not only as a normative concept. It will become clear in a second what I mean by this. But first, I would like to mention the notion of sovereignty in relation to something about the notion of sovereignty in relation to the notion of autonomy. Autonomy is not, when I use the term autonomy, I do not refer to the humanist self-determination kind of interpretation of autonomy. There's no autonomy from the creator, of course, but it's autonomy from from other spheres. That means that each sphere, social sphere, is independent, and that's what I meant. And so the autonomy of the church sphere means that it's does not mean that it's autonomous from God, naturally, but that it's autonomous from other spheres, right? So that's sovereignty, and that's why it's called sphere sovereignty, because it allows God's sovereignty actually to be expressed in each of these spheres against, as Abraham Kuyper mentioned, frequently against the concept of popular sovereignty, for example. Okay, so what we can do with the concept of sphere sovereignty is we can really highlight the multidimensionality of religious freedom, what I just mentioned a minute ago, that in every sphere of society there is religious expression that should be possible, that should be accepted, and religious freedom covers all those dimensions. So individual, collective dimensions in the church sphere, outside the church sphere, and therefore there should also be religious freedom includes the right of parents to educate their children according to their religious convictions. That's also a form of part of religious freedom. In the family sphere, and there's also religious freedom in the education sphere, naturally, and also in politics. Why shouldn't religious people be allowed to intervene in politics based on their convictions? Okay, and that's my proposal then, is to define restrictions on religious freedom, which are commonly referred to as religious persecution, as any restriction on religious expression in any sphere of society. So it becomes an analytical category, an analytical model to gauge those areas where religious freedom is being infringed. And therefore, we can approach religious conflicts in terms of infringed sphere autonomy. I think that is very important. So, to conclude, I think sphere sovereignty can be presented as a safeguard for religious freedom, because the best guarantee for religious freedom is ensuring not only the autonomy of each sphere, so limited government, where government does not intervene unduly in other spheres. There may be justifications for a government to intervene in other spheres of society. For example, if there's a case of child abuse in the family sphere, well, then we expect the government to intervene. But we don't want the government to intervene when it's not necessary, when it's not appropriate. So if we want to guarantee religious freedom, we need to ensure the autonomy of each sphere of society, and specifically free religious expression in each sphere of society. And that's the message I would like to give. And so, because religious freedom is a multidimensional concept, true religious freedom requires not only a sovereign church sphere, which is the respect of church autonomy, but also the freedom for religious expression, Christian religious expression, Jewish religious expression, Muslim religious expression, in the family sphere, the school sphere, the government sphere, and in all other spheres. Well, finally, the fifth lecture, I would like to present this by lecturer or scholar. I would like to present is C.S. Lewis, who of course was a very prolific author, not really known as a political thinker, but there are many political insights that we can obtain from him, especially in two conferences he pronounced: the abolition of men, a very inspiring conference on postmodernism, and then also the radio talks that were collected in a work called Mere Christianity.
C.S. Lewis is also someone I greatly admire. C.S. Lewis is actually not very known for being a political philosopher. You know, he's really better known as, first of all, literary scholar. That was his job. But he's also very famous as a fiction writer, as a Christian apologist. But he's also a very interesting political philosopher. And it's not very often recognized, because he actually hated party politics, like many people, hate party politics. But that doesn't mean, he hated politics as a theme. Politics is so much more than just political parties and elections, and the dirty things that happen in politics. Politics is, and remember the definition I gave you, it's about promoting a development vision, based on values. Okay, and so C.S. Lewis had many interesting things to say about politics, and well, I won't have time to go into all those points, but one of them is the importance to return to natural law to justify morality. And I think here, we might not necessarily agree, but I do think this is a very important point. And it's basically, what he says is, well, first of all, don't be afraid to apply moral principles to politics. But, he says, don't use the Bible to justify morality. You should really try to appeal to moral law, to reason, to conscience, and not so much to the Bible. First of all, because it's a better strategy to win debates, right? Because if you appeal to natural law, you appeal to a moral common ground, even with people who might not believe in the Bible or not in the same way as you. So there's this existence of a moral common ground. You can reach consensus on basic issues just by honestly, and that's very important, honestly trying to reason about social issues. But it's also the justifying morality based on natural law is also more important because it doesn't come from the Bible. The Bible is the Word of God, yes, but it merely reaffirms it. But even before the Bible was written, the law of nature was already there. God's principles were already there. The Bible just reaffirms what's already present in His creational design, and it's really also the proper foundation to avoid being dogmatic. It's an invitation to really think about why a certain policy is more desirable than another policy, instead of just imposing biblical dogmas. People who impose dogmas, whether it's ideologies or biblical dogmas, are dangerous, or that's at least how they're perceived, right? Now, of course, the Bible, and that's actually the reason why the Bible is not a political manual. It's not. Now, how to be a good ruler? So we saw that Pascal gave his duke some examples, some advice. But what does C.S. Lewis say? Well, the first thing is the importance of humility, and you need to be humble, and you need to recognize it's just not easy. So Jack talked a lot about complexity. Well, that's a reality. Social problems, social issues are complex, are difficult to solve. Okay, and so the first step is to be humble, to recognize it's not easy. It's not easy to solve those problems. It's not easy to translate moral law into public policy. And what this requires is, and it's almost obvious, but it never happens. Or maybe it does, but it requires thinking. You need to think about it. You need to consult experts. You need to research it. It's complex, right? Justin, very honestly shared, his humility. He said he doesn't know, right? That's what he said. You don't know whether what you're doing to address poverty in Africa really works, right? Why? Because it's complicated. If you had the answer, it would already be solved, right? It's difficult. So it's important to think, to really seriously think, and that's why this kind of discussions I think are also very important. Just go in depth into the issues and really discuss them and try to think of solutions. Consult experts. And basically, what C.S. Lewis is saying throughout his work is it's not enough, to be a good person or to be a good Christian, right? Good intentions are not enough. We need quality and excellence. We need to think through the problems. But it's not only about humility; it's also about prudence. That's the other key word in C.S. Lewis' advice to politicians and people like me who advise politicians. You need to be prudent. You need to be very careful because consequences matter. And C.S. Lewis warns very strongly against idealists, whether they're conservative, biblical Christians, or whether they're communists or whatever. Idealists who take precipitated action, they are dangerous. It's very often, that they make mistakes, and that's again also in this biblical narrative of creation. that man is sinful, but not only sinful, man has limited knowledge, about the world around him, and so it's just very difficult to, again, as I said, to address the complexity of the problems that need to be solved. And man can be blinded by selfishness, for example, or greed, very easily, without even, realizing it. Or they can be blinded by, utopias, by ideal, by ideologies, by formulas. It's and that's where I think another key point comes into play, and that is that earthly perfection is unattainable. In the end, as Jesus also said, the poor will always be with you, right? And so here another point is, in all those ideologies, any ideologies, what all those ideologies imply is, well, if we change these structures, if we change these institutions, then people will behave, right? So, for example, if there's a particular problem of crime in a neighborhood, say, okay, well, let's set up an arts facility so people go to the theater and they won't be involved in crime anymore. That's idealistic to think that way. But I've seen many consultants recommend that kind of policies. It's not by creating an institution that you're going to change the people. You need to be pragmatic, you need to be realistic about human condition. And that's where all the idealists, all ideologies are actually wrong. And it doesn't mean, you're not going to be wrong, it doesn't mean that you should not try to create proper institutions to help people behave in a better way. But you should not expect your salvation from those institutions. You need to recognize always that man is sinful, and so you should not put your faith in changing structures. And then, so be humble, and what's best is to work quietly at solving one problem at a time. I think that's probably C.S. best advice. Don't try to solve all the problems, because if you come across someone who says that they can solve all the problems in the world, they've got the formula, the ideology, that's what communism did, for example. We have to do it this way, that will take away all inequality, all problems, and then they're wrong. You're almost certain that they'll be wrong. Okay, so don't be deceived by people like that. And again, consequences matter. And sometimes you try to solve a problem, but by solving it you make it worse, right? And that's also a very strong concept you see also in literature, etc. But there's also practical examples of that. For example, environmentalists who care about the environment, there's this. One of the things they promote is they want people to use less paper tissues, right? Because that's polluting the environment. It's wasting paper and everything, right? But and so instead of people using paper tissues, they use clothes and handkerchiefs, right? But it turns out that that's not the solution. Why? Because if you really do the math and look at it, those handkerchiefs are actually worse for the environment, which you want to help, you want to improve the environment. Why is it worse for the environment? Well, because you need to wash it, and that costs energy, and the chemicals you use to clean it, etc. So actually you're polluting more by promoting a policy that's supposed to reduce pollution, right? So that's just one example of how consequences matter. People did not look at the consequences properly, right? C. Lewis also says, well, okay, so you need to think, that's very important. You need to be humble, you need to be prudent, you need to use scientific knowledge, but you need to be careful not to leave everything to those experts, to technocrats, because they cannot take moral decisions. That's also a very important point. And here I don't know how to solve this, but you need to basically try to gather all the intelligence, all the information, all the data that you can to make a decision, and consult all the experts that you can. But don't let those experts decide. it's not technical decisions in the end. It's political decisions. It's moral decisions.